What if enduring daily humiliation at your new waitressing job was actually the doorway to an extraordinary turn of fate? Shanice Jackson needed this position at Riverdale Family Restaurant more than anything. With 3 children to feed and rent already overdue, she swallowed her pride each time owner Gerald Whitman loudly mocked her southern accent in front of customers and staff. The other servers warned her about his notorious prejudice against anyone who looked or sounded different, but Shanice persisted with unwavering professionalism, serving each table with genuine warmth despite the knot of shame tightening in her chest whenever Gerald appeared. On a particularly busy Friday evening, as Gerald performed yet another cruel imitation that left a table of businessmen laughing at her expense, Shanice had no idea that among them sat someone with the power to completely shatter the foundation of everything Gerald had built and transform her struggling life into something she could never have imagined. The lock on apartment 412 always stuck in humid weather, requiring Shanice Jackson to jostle the key while balancing her purse and the paper bag containing leftover biscuits she had managed to sneak from the restaurant. The familiar scent of cinnamon air freshener attempting to mask the persistent mildew greeted her as she entered the cramped 2-bedroom apartment where her 3 children sat huddled around the coffee table, textbooks illuminated by the flickering glow of nearly melted candles. Electricity had been a luxury they could no longer afford. After the landlord raised the rent for the 3rd time in 8 months, with past due notices now wallpapering the inside of her kitchen drawer alongside medical bills from when her youngest had developed pneumonia last winter, dropping her aching body onto the worn sofa with springs that pushed through the fabric like accusing fingers, Shanice emptied her apron pockets and began arranging coins and crumpled bills into pitiful stacks. $27.35 for a 10-hour shift of forced smiles and quiet dignity, while Gerald Whitman performed his daily ritual of mockery for customer entertainment. Her eldest daughter, Tiana, looked up from her algebra homework, the candlelight casting shadows that made her 13-year-old face appear much older as her eyes met her mother's reddened ones. "He did it again, didn't he?" she whispered. Not really a question, but an understanding that passed between them, like so many other unspoken truths about how the world treated black women trying to keep their families afloat in a system designed to drown them. Shanice forced her lips into what she hoped resembled a smile and slid the leftover biscuits toward her children, deftly changing the subject to upcoming school projects while her mind calculated whether the tips plus tomorrow's pay might stretch far enough to get the electricity reconnected before her children fell behind in school. The weight of accumulated humiliations pressed against her chest as she recalled Gerald imitating the way she pronounced certain words, his voice exaggerating her Alabama accent while customers laughed and left bigger tips for the entertainment he provided at her expense. Watching her children divide the food carefully between them, saving the larger portions for their younger brother, who had already fallen asleep clutching his science textbook, Shanice wondered silently how many more days she could walk into that restaurant and endure being the punchline of a joke rooted in prejudice that predated her very existence. The children needed stability, food, electricity, and most importantly, a mother who showed them that dignity could survive intact even when wrapped in circumstances that threatened to crush it daily. So tomorrow she would return to Riverdale Family Restaurant, don the stained uniform hanging in the bathroom, and serve each table with the same warm smile that concealed both her exhaustion and her determination that this situation would somehow, someday change. Friends, before we go further, may I ask a small favor? Please subscribe to our channel. It truly helps us keep bringing you these stories, and reaching 1,000 subscribers soon is so important for us to continue. We also love hearing from you. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how our little storytelling circle is spreading across the world. And if you enjoyed the beginning, give this video a like, and let's share thoughts on the whole story together below. Dawn had barely broken over the Riverdale Strip Mall when a sleek black Lexus with tinted windows eased into the empty parking lot, its polished surface reflecting the flickering neon sign with 3 burned-out letters. Marcus Wells straightened his tailored charcoal suit before stepping out, his leather portfolio tucked under one arm, as he surveyed the establishment that generated more customer complaints than any other location in the Sunrise Restaurant Group portfolio. As regional vice president of operations, Marcus had spent the previous evening dining incognito, witnessing firsthand how the owner had publicly ridiculed a black waitress with a southern accent while serving his table of supposed business associates. Now, returning before the 6 a.m. opening for an unannounced inspection, Marcus moved silently toward the rear delivery entrance, pausing as angry voices carried through the partially open door. The muggy kitchen air hit him like a wall as he stepped inside unnoticed, the atmosphere thick with steam from industrial dishwashers and the scent of bacon grease coating every surface. Gerald Whitman stood with his back to the entrance, his finger jabbing toward the face of a young Latino man in food-stained whites who stared at the floor while enduring a barrage of slurs about his heritage and intelligence. 4 other kitchen staff continued prepping vegetables with practiced efficiency, their expressions carefully blank as though they had mastered the art of invisibility during these regular tirades. Marcus observed how the space itself seemed to hold its breath. Stainless steel surfaces reflecting fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead, like the tension vibrating between shoulder blades of every person forced to weather this verbal storm. With practiced discretion that came from years investigating toxic workplace cultures, Marcus slid his Mont Blanc pen from his breast pocket and made careful notations in his leather portfolio, documenting exact phrases and timestamps, while his jaw muscles tightened almost imperceptibly. As a black executive who had climbed through corporate ranks by maintaining rigid control over his emotions, Marcus recognized the particular poison of bigotry masked as management that infected this establishment, connecting invisible dots between the waitress from last night whose name tag read Shanice and these kitchen workers all enduring the same systematic degradation. When Gerald finally turned from his target to bark orders at the prep cooks, his face flushed red with the exertion of his anger. He stopped cold at the sight of the distinguished visitor whose presence instantly shifted the power dynamic in the steamy kitchen. Marcus allowed himself one small satisfaction in the flash of panic that crossed Gerald's face before it rearranged itself into an obsequious smile, knowing that neither the restaurant owner nor the quietly observant staff yet understood that yesterday's cruel public mockery of Shanice had set in motion events that would soon fundamentally alter the foundation of everything within these grease-stained walls. The lunch rush transformed Riverdale Family Restaurant into a cacophony of clattering plates and overlapping conversations as Shanice balanced 3 steaming platters along her forearm, weaving between packed tables with practiced precision. She noticed him immediately, the businessman from the corporate group last night, now dressed in casual jeans and a polo shirt, sitting alone in her section by the window where sunlight illuminated his contemplative expression. Gerald intercepted her path toward the kitchen, loudly mimicking the way she had just said "southern fried chicken" to an elderly couple who chuckled uncomfortably, their eyes avoiding hers in that familiar way that acknowledged the cruelty while participating in it nonetheless. Shanice maintained her professional smile as heat crawled up her neck, focusing instead on the mysterious customer whose observant gaze seemed to miss nothing about the interaction. When she approached his table with a water pitcher, he introduced himself simply as Marcus and asked questions that customers rarely bothered with: how long she had worked there, whether she enjoyed it, what path had led her to this particular job. Something in his attentive silence encouraged her to share fragments of truth normally kept hidden behind her service smile. The business administration degree she had earned through night classes while raising her children, the promising interview opportunities that evaporated after her husband Anthony died suddenly from an undetected heart condition 3 years ago, leaving her with funeral costs that depleted their modest savings. The restaurant grew louder around them as the lunch crowd peaked, yet their conversation created a peculiar bubble of calm amid the chaos, especially when Marcus shared his own story of rising through corporate ranks after starting as a dishwasher at 16. Gerald appeared tableside twice during their exchange, each time performing his exaggerated imitation of her accent for the apparent entertainment of nearby diners. Yet Shanice noticed how Marcus observed these incidents with unnervingly focused attention, his notebook appearing briefly before disappearing back into his pocket. As she refilled his coffee for the third time, Gerald called across the restaurant for her to hurry up with the orders for table 12, adding a particularly cruel comment about her comprehension skills that caused several patrons to laugh. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice pitched just for her ears, as he placed a generous tip beneath his saucer. "Sometimes people mistake kindness for weakness," he told her, his eyes communicating a deeper meaning beyond the words themselves. That momentary connection lingered with Shanice throughout her shift. A curious feeling that something significant had shifted in her world, though she could not possibly have understood then how this brief encounter would ultimately rewrite the story of her life and everyone else who worked under Gerald Whitman's petty tyranny. The corporate fax machine whirred to life at 4:17 on a Tuesday afternoon, spitting out an official memorandum that drained the color from Gerald Whitman's face as he read it 3 times in disbelief. Sunrise Restaurant Group would conduct a comprehensive financial and operational audit beginning Thursday morning, requiring full access to all employee records, payroll documentation, inventory logs, and management practices. The cluttered office behind the kitchen suddenly seemed to shrink around Gerald as he surveyed the chaotic piles of paperwork representing years of creative accounting and deliberately sloppy record-keeping that had allowed him to skim profits while underpaying staff. Panic propelled him into the dining area, where he announced mandatory overtime for all employees, his voice carrying an edge that silenced even the chattiest servers. "Everyone must help prepare for corporate inspection," he insisted, though his specific instructions for Shanice revealed a targeted cruelty as he assigned her to organize the disaster zone of his office while simultaneously covering the busiest dinner section and handling closing duties. The fluorescent bulb flickered erratically above Shanice as she worked well past midnight, sorting through years of haphazardly filed documents spilling from overstuffed cabinets while Gerald paced nervously, barking contradictory orders before leaving her to complete the impossible task alone. Her fingers paused on a faded manila folder labeled Staff Payment Records when she noticed a curious pattern within. Her own hourly rate recorded in the official books at $8.75 while the internal worksheet listed $6.50, with similar discrepancies for every minority employee but perfectly matching numbers for white staff members. The realization crystallized slowly as Shanice flipped through quarter after quarter of systematic wage theft, each page revealing Gerald had been pocketing the difference while reporting proper wages to corporate and tax authorities. Similar folders revealed altered tip distribution records, manipulated hours, and denied overtime payments, creating a comprehensive portrait of financial fraud targeting specific employees based entirely on their race or accent. Gerald returned unexpectedly, startling her as she quickly rearranged the folders to hide her discovery, observing how his typically domineering posture had collapsed into something almost pitiful. Sweat stained the underarms of his polo shirt as he muttered about corporate witch hunts and ungrateful employees who might speak against him. For the first time since starting at Riverdale, Shanice saw vulnerability crack through his facade of absolute authority, revealing the fundamental cowardice beneath his years of abusive behavior. She maintained a carefully neutral expression as Gerald instructed her to organize the records in a presentable manner, never suspecting she now possessed knowledge that could potentially destroy everything he had built through years of systematic exploitation. The weight of this information pressed against her chest as she considered the risk of speaking up versus the collective injustice suffered by dozens of employees whose financial struggles were directly connected to the fraud documented in these disorganized files, wondering if the mysterious Marcus might somehow be connected to this sudden corporate interest in a restaurant location previously ignored by headquarters. Thursday morning arrived with an air of nervous anticipation as 3 polished corporate sedans pulled into the Riverdale parking lot, disgorging a team of professionally dressed auditors clutching tablets and briefcases. Marcus Wells led the procession through the front entrance where Gerald waited with an overly enthusiastic welcome that failed to mask the anxiety tightening his features. The staff watched from peripheral vision as Marcus explained the process. Complete review of financial records followed by private interviews with every employee in the converted supply closet that Gerald had hastily cleared to serve as an interview room. Tension electrified the air during the breakfast service as Gerald circulated among the staff, his voice lowered to an urgent whisper, as he reminded each person that their continued employment depended entirely on positive representations of his management style. The business survival speech transformed when delivered to the predominantly minority kitchen staff, becoming barely veiled threats about immigration checks and the impossibility of finding comparable work with their limited qualifications. Customers sensed the unusual atmosphere, conversations hushing whenever an auditor appeared tableside observing service interactions or making notes about facility conditions. During an unexpected lull, Gerald called an impromptu staff meeting in the cramped break room where flickering fluorescent lights cast sickly shadows across worried faces. His typical bluster had transformed into something more dangerous as he paced before them, emphasizing how he alone had given opportunities to people who would otherwise be unemployable, his gaze lingering meaningfully on the Hispanic busboys and black serving staff. Shanice felt her heartbeat accelerate as Gerald suddenly pivoted toward her, crowding her against the dented metal lockers, while the room temperature seemed to plummet. "Your kind should be grateful for any job," he hissed, close enough that she could smell the coffee souring on his breath, his meaning unmistakable as he elaborated that certain people were given chances here despite their obvious shortcomings, glancing pointedly at her name tag, as though her identity itself was offensive. The 6 other waitresses found sudden interest in their shoes or phones, shoulders curving inward with the familiar shame of witnessing cruelty without intervention, their silence complicit protection of their own precarious positions. Something fundamental shifted within Shanice as she absorbed both the explicit racism and the isolation of facing it alone, even as her mind calculated the impossibility of finding another job quickly enough to prevent her family from becoming homeless if she challenged his authority. Through the break room window, she glimpsed Marcus watching the interaction from the hallway, his expression revealing nothing yet somehow communicating everything about the moral crossroads now facing her. Speak the documented truth about years of discrimination and wage theft, or protect her immediate financial security by remaining silent about injustices affecting dozens of vulnerable employees just like herself. The interview schedule posted beside the time clock showed Shanice slotted for 2:30, giving her 4 hours to wrestle with the knowledge burning inside her chest like a smoldering coal. Each time she passed Marcus in the dining area, his eyes conveyed unspoken understanding while Gerald shadowed the audit team with increasingly frantic attempts to control their access to certain records and staff members. During her brief lunch break, Shanice locked herself in the single-stall employee bathroom where the perpetual drip from the rusted faucet matched the rhythm of her racing thoughts. Speaking truth meant potentially sacrificing rent money, electricity, and food security for her children, yet remaining silent perpetuated a system deliberately designed to exploit those with the fewest options. The door creaked open as Lucinda from morning shift entered, her normally cheerful face drawn with concern as she whispered that Gerald had been systematically stealing tips and underpaying minority staff for years, confirming what Shanice had discovered in those midnight hours organizing financial records. The cramped bathroom with its peeling wallpaper and flickering light fixture became an unexpected confessional as Maria from the kitchen joined them, revealing how Gerald had refused her legally mandated breaks for 3 years while scheduling her just under the hour threshold for healthcare benefits. Their whispered exchange attracted Jamal from dishwashing, who stood guard outside while sharing through the cracked door how Gerald routinely altered his time card, erasing hours that disappeared from his paycheck. One by one, employees created excuses to visit this makeshift sanctuary, each adding threads to a tapestry of systematic abuse, targeting those Gerald considered expendable. immigrants whose limited English prevented them from challenging missing overtime, single mothers whose childcare constraints made their schedules vulnerable to manipulation, and workers whose racial backgrounds Gerald openly mocked while secretly exploiting their financial desperation. Somewhere between the seventh and eighth confession, Shanice felt something profound crystallize within her understanding. This choice transcended her individual circumstances, becoming about fundamental human dignity and the moral responsibility of those who recognize injustice to speak its name regardless of personal cost. The faces surrounding her in that tiny bathroom reflected years of accumulated indignities weathered in silent endurance, yet now vibrated with cautious hope that someone might finally give voice to their collective experience. As the minute hand crept toward her interview time, Lucinda pressed something into Shanice's palm, a carefully maintained personal log documenting years of discrepancies between reported tips and actual distribution, along with dated notes about discriminatory practices witnessed during her 4 years of employment. "Everyone here is counting on you," she whispered, "though they all understand if you can't risk it," as the unspoken weight of 20 families, financial survival balanced against the moral imperative of justice, delayed, but perhaps no longer denied. The converted supply closet had been hastily transformed into an interview space, with 2 folding chairs facing each other beneath buzzing fluorescent lights that cast everyone in an unflattering pallor. Shanice clutched her purse containing the folder of evidence while observing framed corporate awards displayed on a temporary table. Sunrise Restaurant Group Commitment to Diversity, Excellence and Community Leadership in Workplace Equality, creating an ironic backdrop to her lived reality. Marcus Wells sat across from her, his tablet recording their conversation as 2 other auditors flanked him, with expressions of practiced neutrality that revealed nothing about their thoughts. The initial questions followed standard procedure: workplace satisfaction, training adequacy, management accessibility, all answered with the cautious diplomacy Shanice had rehearsed in her mind throughout the morning shift. Then came the pivot point that would forever divide her life into before and after. "Is there anything specific about operations at this location that corporate headquarters should know?" The weight of 20 families pressed against her chest as she considered the children depending on her income, the electricity still not reconnected in her apartment, and the very real possibility that speaking truth would leave her unemployed by sunset. Her fingers trembled slightly as she withdrew the documentation from her purse. Her own meticulous records combined with Lucinda's log and photographed evidence of the discrepancy sheets from Gerald's office. Marcus leaned forward almost imperceptibly as Shanice explained in precise, measured words how wage theft targeted specific employees based entirely on racial background or accent, systematically siphoning thousands from those least able to absorb such losses. Something shifted in Marcus' expression as she continued detailing exact amounts, dates, and patterns while presenting collaborative evidence from 6 other employees who had trusted her to speak their collective truth. His professional reserve softened into unmistakable respect when she acknowledged her fear, yet articulated that some principles must outweigh personal security, her voice gaining strength with each example of injustice that had flourished in the shadow of silence. The fluorescent light flickered above them as corporate platitudes mounted on temporary display contrasted sharply with the documented reality of discrimination she methodically exposed, creating an unspoken understanding between herself and Marcus that transcended their respective positions. When she finished speaking, the silence held a particular quality that acknowledged something momentous had occurred. A woman society had repeatedly dismissed as powerless had demonstrated extraordinary courage by choosing justice over security, integrity over comfort, and collective welfare over individual protection. Marcus closed his tablet with deliberate care, thanking her with a formality that barely contained deeper appreciation for what they both recognized as moral courage in its purest form. his eyes communicating that her sacrifice would not be forgotten even as uncertainty about her immediate future followed her back to the dining floor where Gerald watched with suspicious eyes. Friday morning arrived with handwritten signs taped to the restaurant doors announcing an unexpected closure for a mandatory staff meeting. The normally bustling dining room transformed as tables were pushed aside to create rows of chairs facing the corner booth, where Marcus and 4 corporate executives waited with tablets and folders arranged before them. Tension electrified the air as employees filed in silently, forming nervous clusters divided largely along racial lines that unconsciously mapped the very power dynamics under investigation. Gerald arrived last, his typical swagger diminished by lack of sleep and mounting anxiety, as he took the only remaining seat directly before the impromptu tribunal. Marcus stood with quiet authority, the casual clothes from previous visits replaced by an impeccably tailored suit that signaled something significant had shifted in the power dynamics of the room. What followed shattered the foundation of reality as everyone had understood it. Marcus Wells introduced himself not as a regional manager, but as the newly appointed Chief Executive Officer of Sunrise Restaurant Group, conducting a company-wide culture audit following disturbing patterns identified in customer feedback and employee turnover rates. The blood drained visibly from Gerald Whitman's face as Marcus methodically outlined his week of observation, beginning with witnessing public mockery of Shanice while dining incognito, continuing through documentation of racial slurs directed at kitchen staff, and culminating with financial evidence displayed on the wall via projector showing systematic wage theft targeting employees based explicitly on racial background. Photographs of altered time cards appeared alongside spreadsheets, revealing the precise amount stolen from each affected employee over years, totaling nearly $200,000 in unpaid wages from this location alone. Gerald attempted interruption but fell silent when Marcus produced recorded statements from 17 current employees describing specific instances of discrimination, harassment, and financial manipulation, their collective testimony creating a comprehensive portrait of deliberate exploitation. The atmosphere in the dining room shifted perceptibly as employees who had entered fearful gradually straightened in their chairs, something like cautious hope replacing the resignation that had become their professional uniform under Gerald's management. Marcus' voice remained measured, yet carried unmistakable authority, as he explained that corporate legal counsel had already filed formal reports with the Department of Labor and Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, while Sunrise Restaurant Group would immediately compensate all affected employees with back pay plus damages to be calculated by an independent auditor. The final blow fell with quiet devastation as Marcus announced that effective immediately, Gerald Whitman was terminated from all association with Sunrise Restaurant Group, with civil litigation pending based on documented evidence of financial fraud, creating tax liability for the corporation through falsified records, and violating multiple federal employment regulations, including Title VII protections against workplace discrimination. Cornered and desperate, Gerald surged to his feet with spittle flying from his lips as he jabbed an accusing finger toward Shanice, sitting quietly in the third row. "She planned this whole thing," he shouted, face flushed crimson, as he described her as a troublemaker who manipulated evidence to create false impressions of discrimination that had never existed in his family-friendly establishment. The venom in his voice seemed to physically hang in the air between them, as he elaborated wild conspiracy theories about her character, work ethic, and motivation. While employees exchanged uncomfortable glances at this public unraveling, then something extraordinary happened that would forever alter the atmosphere of Riverdale Family Restaurant. Lucinda stood silently and moved to stand beside Shanice, her gaze fixed directly on Gerald without a trace of the fear that had governed their interactions for years. Maria from the kitchen followed without hesitation, then Jamal from dishwashing, then the hostess, then both prep cooks, until one by one every single employee rose from their seats to physically surround Shanice in a human shield of solidarity that rendered Gerald increasingly small and isolated before them. When Marcus invited anyone with contradicting evidence to speak freely, the silence stretched meaningful seconds until Eduardo from the kitchen described in halting English how Gerald had threatened his family when he questioned missing overtime pay. His testimony unleashed a flood, as voices previously silenced by economic vulnerability finally spoke their accumulated truths, while Gerald shrank visibly with each revelation, his desperate interruptions falling flat against the wall of authenticity surrounding him. The fluorescent lights that had always cast harsh shadows now illuminated a profound transformation as Marcus officially announced Gerald Whitman permanently terminated from all positions within Sunrise Restaurant Group, effective immediately and without severance. Corporate security appeared at the service entrance, waiting to escort Gerald from the premises after he surrendered company property including keys, access codes, and financial documentation. Marcus' voice carried resonant authority as he outlined immediate changes. The restaurant would close for 1 week for complete restructuring. Every employee would maintain full pay during this period, and comprehensive compensation packages were being calculated to address years of wage theft, with additional consideration for emotional damages resulting from documented harassment. The atmosphere within those familiar walls shifted tangibly from the heavy silence of fear to something bright with possibility, as employees who had never spoken freely at work began sharing stories, contact information, and even tentative smiles across previously unbridgeable divides of position and background. Shanice felt something warm cascading down her cheeks before realizing they were tears, not of humiliation that had become so familiar within these walls, but of vindication as the weight of enduring daily indignities suddenly lifted from her shoulders, while colleagues who had witnessed her struggle now approached with gentle congratulations, gratitude, and newfound respect that acknowledged her courage had catalyzed their collective liberation. Sunlight streamed through polished windows of Riverdale Family Restaurant, illuminating a space transformed beyond recognition with warm color schemes, comfortable seating, and walls adorned with employee recognition photos celebrating the diverse team responsible for making this location the highest performing in the entire Sunrise Restaurant Group portfolio. Shanice Jackson reviewed the quarterly profit reports in her glass-walled office, where the scent of cinnamon candles created an atmosphere of welcome rather than intimidation, a deliberate choice reflecting her management philosophy that respect yielded better results than fear ever could. The framed certificates lining her walls told a remarkable story of transformation. 6 consecutive months of customer satisfaction, excellence, community leadership awards, and most meaningfully, the handwritten thank you cards from staff members whose lives had fundamentally changed through proper compensation and advancement opportunities in an environment where their humanity was valued regardless of accent or appearance. When Marcus Wells arrived for his quarterly visit, his smile conveyed genuine pride as he observed the bustling dining room where servers from 12 different cultural backgrounds moved efficiently through lunch service, while genuine laughter occasionally rose above the pleasant buzz of conversation. Shanice welcomed him into her office, where fresh flowers brightened the desk that once housed evidence of systematic discrimination but now displayed photographs of her children. Tiana proudly wearing her science fair medal, the twins playing in their new backyard, and all 3 studying comfortably in a living room with proper lighting and new furniture. Marcus settled into the visitor chair with news that exceeded even her most ambitious dreams. Corporate headquarters had created a new position specifically for her talents, Director of Workplace Culture and Diversity Programs, responsible for implementing throughout all 128 locations the transformative policies she had pioneered at Riverdale. Your struggle gave voice to hundreds, Marcus told her, explaining how her courage had sparked a company-wide audit revealing similar patterns at dozens of locations where employees previously suffered in silence, creating a ripple effect of accountability that had fundamentally altered the corporate culture from headquarters to the newest franchise opening next month. Shanice traced her fingers along the edge of her nameplate, remembering the woman who once counted coins at a kitchen table by candlelight, terrified of losing a job that systematically exploited her while undermining her dignity, barely recognizing herself in the confident executive whose innovation had increased company profits while simultaneously improving working conditions across 23 states. The journey from that cramped apartment to this sunlit office contained a universal truth she planned to share throughout the organization: that moral courage might initially appear costly, but ultimately creates foundations for transformation that transcend individual circumstances, and that systems designed to diminish human worth invariably collapse when confronted by those brave enough to speak truth regardless of perceived power differentials.